Welcome to the American Indian and Alaska Native Behavioral Health webinar series, presented by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I'm Kate Trans, and I will be administering today's webinar. Today, Dr. Clyde McCoy will be presenting The Real All-Americans. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center, or ATTC. We are one of 4 national focus centers which serve the ATTC network. The ATTC network also includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. To learn more about our center, the network, or your regional center, please visit our website. The next webinar in this series is scheduled for Wednesday, September 3, when Dr. Felicia Gaither will present an overview of the Tribal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. We also offer the Essential Substance Abuse Skills webinar series each month. Our next session in this series will be held on August 20, when basic counseling skills will be presented by Beth Boyd. For more information on our webinar series, you can contact me at the email address or phone number provided on this slide. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEHs for a $15 fee. The CEH request form is available for download in the Files pod in the webinar screen. I will also be sending this form in a follow-up email to all who attended. Immediately following today's webinar, you'll be redirected to our GPRA evaluation. GPRA stands for the Government Performance and Results Act, and SAMHSA asks us to evaluate our events in order to comply with this act and provide improved performance assessment and accountability. This survey asks about your satisfaction with the event and will take less than 10 minutes to complete. We thank you in advance for helping us improve our programs. Before we start today's session, I'd like to go over a few instructions for the Adobe Connect system. To view the presentation in full screen mode, click on the full screen button at the top right corner of the presentation pod, which looks like 4 arrows pointing outward. To return to the regular view, click the button again. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar. Please use the Q&A pod to share your questions and comments, and we will address questions at appropriate points during the presentation. We would also like you to be aware that this webinar records participant attention time. If you minimize the webinar or are working in another window, the system will record your participation as inactive, which may be reflected in the number of CEHs received. The opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official position of CSAT, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I would like to especially thank Alex Mendez for his support in preparing today's webinar. Mr. Mendez is a Master's of Public Health student at the University of Miami and is working as Dr. McCoy's research assistant. And today's webinar is presented by Dr. Clyde McCoy. Dr. McCoy is a professor and chair emeritus in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, as well as the director of the Comprehensive Drug Research Center at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Among his many other credentials, he also served as the president of the Atlantic Coast Conference and is a member of the University of Miami Sports Hall of Fame. I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of interesting anecdotes from his experiences today, and we're just so thrilled to have him joining us. So I'd like to welcome Dr. McCoy, and I'm going to get his slides in a moment, and then we should be ready to go. It's all yours.
Thank you, Kate, so very much. We're so happy to be with you here today. I'll start with an anecdote. I just spent 2.5 weeks in Australia and New Zealand, and I'm having a little bit jet lag, and I'll be continuing to drink liquids throughout this, just tea and water, that is. Nothing more powerful than that. But we're very pleased to be able to share with you today, and I think you'll understand later the reason for the title, The Real All-Americans. As Kate has introduced us, you'll realize that we are sports fans, some would say fanatics. Alex, my research assistant, actually turned down a Major League Baseball contract in order to come and work with me. and he is an excellent research assistant, and he's going to be a better MD than he is a baseball player. Our first series today will be talking about Iowa. We have two timelines that Alex has prepared for you. And first we want to do a little bit of local history with Iowa, because we're going to introduce you to several personalities today. Some of them you've heard of, some of them you have not. But even if you have heard of them, you might not know of their history. And so one of the stars of our performance today is the greatest athlete in the world, Jim Thorpe. I think we all know the name of Jim Thorpe, and some of you might not realize that his tribe was actually an Iowa tribe, the Second Fox, and they were moved before the Trail of Tears happened to my people out of Appalachia to the west. The movement of the Iowa peoples were started before that, but it's part of the same history of the invasion of the Europeans, and that continued, and in some ways it still continues today, as every treaty that's been signed with the federal government has been broken. The last was in 1964 when they dammed Lake Seneca, and Johnny Cash even wrote a protest album and went up, and even in 1964, because it was an Indian protest, they banned his album called Bitter Tears. I highly recommend that you get that. Most people are not familiar with it. So this timeline goes to Iowa. Most of you probably don't know that Buffalo Bill Cody was also born in Iowa. This is another timeline that goes back from the 1500s, and we'll be introducing characters to you today. And St. Augustine is very key in our discussion of even Jim Thorpe, as St. Augustine became the main prison where they sent the Indians after they were captured during the Indian Wars that went on until the 1890s. And we'll be talking about that very famous prison, Fort Marion, and Captain Pratt, who was the superintendent. He was considered a great Indian fighter, and many well-known Indians were incarcerated in Fort Marion. Fort Marion was the name given to it. It was one of the oldest Spanish forts built in the Caribbean. It was the oldest in the United States, and modeled after the oldest in Puerto Rico. This timeline you can download, and it will help you keep track of some of the historical figures that we'll be talking about today in our presentation. The main thing we'd like to emphasize today is that we have some glorious history of our peoples, and most of their accomplishments have been left out of history, or has been changed or modified, and too much of what we know about American Indian and their history comes from fictional movies and fictional characters where the cowboys almost always won. And we need to change that. I think it's very important for our young people that they understand that they too have a glorious history that they can be proud of. If you'd ask most Americans to name one Indian, most of the people could probably name Geronimo. And Geronimo became famous in large part through the movies and dime store novels. And he was a true character. And he was a great warrior. He was a member of the Apache. And he became known for his bravery, for his fortitude, and for his ability to continuously escape from his captors, both Mexicans and Americans. Geronimo's entire family was sent to Fort Marion. And as I said before, there were many well-known Indians that were sent there. They actually decided not to send Geronimo there. He was such a great escape artist that he was afraid that he would lead a rebellion of the entire Indian prisoners and do it successfully. And so they put him at Fort Pickett in Florida, away from the other main Indian prisoners that were at Fort Marion. Geronimo was one of 6 American Indians that actually led the inaugural address for President Roosevelt in 1905, and you'll hear about some of those other Indians who were there. Geronimo was imprisoned for most of his life. Even when he rode in the inaugural parade, he did so as a prisoner, and he died at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Another warrior that some historians would say was even greater than Geronimo is that of Quanah. And Quanah is said to have never lost a battle against either the Americans or Mexicans. And he's become well known in part because of his mother. His mother had been a captive of the Comanche and was the mother of Quanah, and gave him somewhat a different perspective as it became obvious that the American Indian was going to be torn down with the American soldiers, particularly after the Civil War. The Civil War was a distraction with the Americans fighting against the American Indian. But after the Civil War, some of those soldiers that didn't have much else to do actually became serious Indian fighters. And Quanah was part of that, but later on he became a very successful business person and lived a very successful life and had a great deal of success later on in his life. He, along with Geronimo, also was a part of the inaugural parade of President Roosevelt. These are some pictures of Quanah, and the one on the left sort of shows him after he had quit his warrior days and become a very successful rancher and business person. This is someone that we've probably all heard about and might not even realize that he was an American Indian. Like myself, he was Cherokee. He was Cherokee from Oklahoma. We're Cherokee from the Eastern Band. We were part of that group that stayed behind and was able to create a land trust. But Will Rogers was one of the most successful people ever in the movies and on the speaker circuit. He was endearing wherever he went. He was one of the world's great storytellers. And he was very proud to be a Cherokee. And I love the statement, my ancestors didn't come over on the Mayflower, but they met the boat. And he would probably know that when they met the boat in the 1600s, that a couple of the American Indians could actually speak English, and that's why they got along so well with the Pilgrims. And this, of course, is why we have Thanksgiving. The Americans that arrived from Europe were not very successful with farming until they learned better farming techniques from the Indians that were there at the time. They taught them how to use fish as fertilizer and how better to till the soil. And their second crop, having been instructed by the Indians, was very successful, and therefore we have Thanksgiving. And I'm sure Will Rogers would have known much about that, as he was very schooled in his own people's history. What's ironic about Will Rogers being an American Indian, he often played a cowboy, and probably most people would have recognized him more as a cowboy than an Indian. And he would have been much more successful in politics had he wanted to be. Will Rogers would have been a congressman had he chosen to be so. In fact, some people would have thought had he run for the president, he would have been a very successful candidate. So here's another notable personality that we can be proud of. Let's go up to modern times. Some of you might have heard about these two sisters that became famous among sports people as Louisville won the NCAA Women's Championship with the help of Shoni Schimmel. She's from the Umatilla Indian Reservation and accepted a scholarship to Louisville and represented them very well. She also represented the USA in the 2013 World University Games, and now is one of the stars with the WNBA. And not to be outdone, her younger sister now is following in her footsteps and will probably be just as good as she as her sister was. And this is a great story that comes down from their mother. Without their mother insisting on their taking advantage of the opportunities they had as basketball players, she became their coach and began to promote them and make them into champions that they are. And there's a great video out there that I would invite you to go look at. It's called Off the Res, and it's a documentary based on the lives of these two sisters and their great mother. Another great Olympian that we might not have heard of is that of Billy Mills. Billy Mills, a member of the Lakota Sioux tribe, won Olympic gold in 1964 in the 10,000 meter and was awarded by Obama the Presidential Citizen Medal in 2012. And he's still receiving awards, as he received the Theodore Roosevelt Award this year, which is the highest honor given by the NCAA. A part of history that has also been passed by is the role that another group of so-called black Indians have played. And there are many stories about the black Indians, how they became black Indians, etc. Some of this began during the Trail of Tears, when the 5 civilized tribes in the Appalachian region were forced by President Jackson to be removed from their lands, and some of the Indians left and found safety with black families along the way. Blacks found that this was a good partnership. There was this is actually one way in which they could become free people, and particularly their children. It's kind of ironic that you think that as persecuted, as decimated as the Americans were to the American Indian, that there was a group of people that could gain freedom by intermarrying with Native Americans. Particularly here in Florida, we have the Black Seminoles. That came about very early. These came through both military and social alliances. They both could help one another as pressure from the American government pushed the Indians further and further into Florida and even into the Everglades. This group had a particular burden to bear, as they had strong prejudices from most of the groups that were settled in America. They were segregated. Even after slaves, they were segregated. And so that some of them felt a dual burden of being both black and being of the First Peoples, being Indian. These are just a few famous black Indians, and I'd like to talk about one, Crispus Attucks. He is known far and wide in African American circles as being the first martyr of the Revolution. Crispus Attucks was the first person killed during the Boston Massacre that is said to have started the American Revolution. So Crispus Attucks has become a very strong historical figure for African Americans, and we should realize that he is one of the black Indians and had intermarried with them and had a very important history to play, not only among African Americans, but among us Native Americans as well. I want to catch my breath, and when I first began this presentation, the whole presentation was about the real All-Americans. They have become known in history as the team that invented football. This is quite an accolade in our country, where football is so important. As I mentioned, I just came back from Australia and New Zealand, and they're still playing rugby and cricket down there. And so they wanted to know about American football and why we had such great passion for American football. And I just explained, well, the same passion you have for cricket and rugby has been passed on to us. Because really, our American football came down from rugby, and the team that we're going to talk about really changed the game to be more like it is today. And that team that invented football was not Notre Dame, was not Harvard, Yale, but the Carlisle Indians. And this is one of the very controversial stories in American history, is that the boarding schools were started and became a real problem for many American Indian families as their children were removed from their home environment in order to kill the Indian and save the man. And that was the motto of the boarding schools. Well, these boarding schools were actually started by Captain Pratt, who we mentioned before as the captain of, that was the superintendent of Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. This is an extremely interesting story. Pratt was one of the people who had been a hero of sorts in the Civil War, and then turned his attention to Indian fighting. And because he had some relationships with the Indians, they put him in charge of the prison at Fort Marion. While he was superintendent, he began to note the real positive value and attitudes of the American Indian prisoners. And he came to the opinion that it was wrong to merely keep them imprisoned, and he wanted more for them. And so he began to teach and have classes at the prison in St. Augustine, and many of the citizens of St. Augustine at that time became volunteers to come in and begin to teach the Indian prisoners. And one of those volunteers was actually Harriet Beecher Stowe. We know her as, of course, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Abraham Lincoln met her and shook her hand, he said, "I'm proud to shake the hand of the little lady who started the Civil War because of her advocacy for slavery." That advocacy changed to advocacy for the American Indian, due in large part to Captain Pratt's attempt to do something more than imprison the American Indian. He was able to convince the U.S. government, rather than imprisonment, let's start a school. And this became the Carlisle Indian School. It was a converted fort in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Pratt was named its first superintendent. While he was there, they began to recruit people from across the country. And one of those that came to Carlisle, in large part because his father kept sending him to other schools, but he would run away and find his way back home. So Carlisle, Pennsylvania was a long way from Kansas. So his father sent him all the way to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he would eventually join the football team. Jim Thorpe has been called, because of his feats in the Olympics, as the greatest athlete in the world. Just one illustration of that, when he showed up on the Carlisle campus, he was walking across the campus and he saw a bar across two posts. And he asked some people, said, "What's that?" He said, told him, "That's what you're supposed to jump over." So he backed up, still had all his Indian clothes on, and took 2 steps and jumped over. He just broke the high jump record in his plain clothes. That was the kind of athlete that he was. Another interesting story about the Carlisle School is Pop Warner. Pop Warner is whom all the little leagues are named for today. He was a Yalie. He was a coach at Yale, and they had to play against the Carlisle Indians, and he noted something about them that he really liked. He thought that they were different. Football was pretty much rugby. Scrum was based on power. And Pop Warner, when he came to Carlisle, began to change all of that. And this is how they changed the nature of football. is that it went from the brutal, mere physical force of rugby into what we have today as American football, that depended more on exact timing, skilled ball handling. It emphasized speed more than just power. And in the process, they created a lot of innovations in football. One was the screen pass. It'd be hard to imagine American football without the pass today. Well, the first time that the forward screen pass, because in rugby, you lateral behind you, and you still cannot have a forward pass in rugby or Australian football to this day. And when we first allowed the pass, an incomplete pass was a 15-yard penalty. It was very discouraged. But Carlisle, through Pop Warner's coaching, was able to be innovative in that fashion. And he was very fortunate that he had a national team that came to Carlisle, and eventually they began to come mainly for football, some of them. He was one of the first recruiters. Pop Warner was the first ever coach that negotiated a salary, and that was another reason he left Yale and went to Carlisle. When Thorpe came on campus, people immediately realized that this was an individual that was very different, that was very distinctive, not only in terms of athletic prowess, but he was a different individual. He was actually a very quiet, insulated person, and he almost had to be coached into playing football. But Pop Warner wasn't only the football coach, he was also the track coach. He saw in Thorpe an Olympic performer immediately. So he actually held Jim Thorpe out of football so that he could perform in the Olympics. He worked with Jim Thorpe, and Jim didn't like to make people think that he even practiced. He wanted people to realize that he was a natural athlete. He actually practiced very hard, but he gained a reputation of not being able to practice. And so when Pop Warner took him over to the Olympics, he had this reputation. And so people felt like that he wasn't going to perform very well because of this reputation. When Pop was asked, well, Pop, where's your team? He pointed to Jim Thorpe, and he says, that is our team. That's our whole Olympic team. So Pop held him out of football so that he could become the world's greatest athlete. Jim Thorpe won every event he was in. He's the only person in history to win both the decathlon and pentathlon. While he was in the Olympics, he ended up defeating some of the Army players that he would play against later. The King of Sweden termed Jim Thorpe the greatest athlete of all time, and he probably still deserves that title today. There was not any sport that he could not excel in. He became a professional football player as well as a professional baseball player after his college days. The most important probably game in Carlisle's history came during Jim Thorpe's arrival back from the Olympics when Pop Warner finally let him play football. And in 1911, the Carlisle Indians became the talk of the nation. I'd like to say that They were the Miami Hurricanes of the 80s and 90s when we won 5 national championships. And we were not very well known at that time. But Carlisle took the nation even by storm greater than that. People were paying money for the first time to come and see this team play football. All of them Native Americans from all over the United States. Harvard had become the beast of the East. They were the powerhouse. They were the team that everyone wanted to beat, except Army. Army, because of its status as a service academy, were able to recruit some of the best men in the country, and Army was even better than Harvard. And so here we get this team that is scheduled the toughest teams in the nation during this period of time, right after Thorpe became a member of the team. Going up against Harvard, Thorpe scored every point. Not only was he a runner, mainly, but he could also throw the ball, could pass the ball, and during this period of time, kicking was just as important. And he was the field goal kicker as well as the punter. There wasn't anything that he couldn't do on not only the football field, but hardly any sports field that would be made available to him. Because of the controversy that surrounds boarding schools and the insulting history that they've had among our people, even this story has some different meanings and interpretations from it. But to me, having had an opportunity to play sports, I'm Eastern Band Cherokee. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, and I don't think I would have been able to go to college if it hadn't been sports for myself. So that Jim Thorpe was one of my inspirations, and I think he should be an inspiration for all young people out there, and that we can take pride in his accomplishments of what he's meant to all of us who had to go through being an American Indian and the stigma that goes with that even today. I see Alex has put up some information. Yes, I am a real McCoy. Another reason I like the title, The Real Americans. You've probably heard of my family. I'm a direct descendant of the McCoys who fought with the Hatfields. It's the most famous feud, probably not in American history, but ever. I actually grew up on the border of Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. The McCoys were on the Kentucky side, and the Hatfields were on the West Virginia side. And actually, Abraham Lincoln started that feud when he created West Virginia, and the Hatfields were Confederates, and McCoys, for the most part, were Union soldiers. And that actually began the feud. And where I grew up is still a home place. Last year I went, and they now have heritage tours throughout that area of the country over the feud. But we're actually part of the Cherokee Eastern Band. This is the genealogy that Alex has put up. And Daniel McCoy that you see down there was a contemporary with John Ross. And both John Ross and Daniel McCoy were of Irish heritage, and the Irish came to America as farmers, and the Cherokees by far were the best farmers in the Appalachian region, and therefore there was a great deal of intermarriage with the Cherokees as the East Coast was settled by the European Americans. And so the Irish particularly became very integrated into the Cherokee. And so that's my ancestry, and I'll be showing you some more of that. This are two more descendants. These are my grandkids, and this is actually at the fort in St. Augustine, Fort Marion, that we've been talking about, and it's now gone back to its Spanish name of San Marcos Fort. As I said, we were born in Cherokee country, and I'm going to let you go through this. I think this is fairly well known, that the greatest disparities in health and other disparities are still among Native Americans and Alaska Natives. And I'm going to let you go through that on your own. This is something I try to bring up in every seminar workshop that I do now, is that one of the greatest science projects ever, the human genome, shows that there's absolutely no scientific basis for race, and that races cannot be distinguished genetically, and so there's absolutely no genetic or any other reason for the discrimination that we've suffered over the years. And it's due to one thing, and that's greed of the American people, and this person here should go down in American history as the greatest enemy ever of the American Indian. And of course, that is General to be President Jackson. And President Jackson, when he became president, wrote the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Jackson had fought the War of 1812, where the Cherokee fought next to him, and a very famous Cherokee, Genealogy, actually saved his life and was responsible for Jackson being able to live to become president. When Genealogy asked to meet with him in order to try to get him to renege on the Indian Removal Act, Jackson refused to even meet with him, and Genealogy is said to reply, "I'm so sorry I saved his life. I wish I'd have killed him myself." And Jackson is one of the sorriest figures in American history in terms of what he has done to the American Indian. And of course, he was the reason for the Great Trail of Tears, which led to the forced federal removal of the 5 civilized tribes from the Appalachian region to the west. You can find these historical documents in an app that I would like to recommend to you, which is called First Peoples. Just go to the App Store, and it's a free download, and you have these historical documents plus other very good documents that show you in part how we were viewed by most of the people in America. And to be able to call us savage and uncivilized, and I think it was obvious that after gold was found in Dahlonega, Georgia in the early 1800s, there was no stopping the white man from taking our lands. And that's the reason for our decimation, was the greed of the American people that wanted the lands and the resources on that. And so they would not stop until they had accomplished that. I want to bring up one other great historical figure. I apologize for being Cherokee-centric here, but those are my people, and it's a history that I know. One of the greatest people in the history of the world is Sequoyah. Sequoyah is a Cherokee name. Everything that's named Sequoyah comes from that person of Sequoyah. He's the only person in the history of mankind to develop a language by himself when he himself was illiterate and could not read or write. Sequoyah means webfoot or hog's foot because he had a deformed foot, and so therefore he was not going to be considered a great warrior of the Cherokee. He became a silversmith. He also fought in the war as a correspondent, and because he saw the orders of the white man written on talking leaves, he decided that he needed to develop a language, a written language, talking leaves, for his own people. So he became the only person in history to develop a full language by himself. He worked on this for many, many years, and only his daughter. In fact, he was somewhat derailed for spending so much time on this silly thing, but it's one of the greatest things to happen to the American Indian, to give them their own language. And soon after they accepted the syllabary, the Cherokee had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which still exists today and is the forerunner of the communication systems that we have throughout many of our tribes. I mentioned the 5 civilized tribes. These were called civilized by the American government because they were the most integrated with the white man of all those tribes. And every one of these experienced their own trail of tears as their lands were too valuable to leave them to us. And so they were taken away all the way down to Florida, where you get Chief Osceola. Osceola, the Seminoles, and the Miccosukee, of course, still exist here. And Osceola was their great chief. And each of these had great leaders in and of themselves. These are pictures of Cherokee and of General Pratt and Osceola that I actually took in Fort Marion itself. And these are pictures of my people in Cherokee. This is a restored village. It goes back to 1850, and I take my grandkids there all the time. And I want them to be proud and to know their history of being Cherokee. There are many famous First People that you can look at on your own, and some of these we'll not know, and it'll bring us right up to time. These are 6 famous actors, all of whom are American Indian. Wes Studi is probably the best known for he is fluent in Cherokee. He's Oklahoma Cherokee, and has done many documentaries. For example, the Trail of Tears documentary he does, he commentates fully in the Cherokee language. So we appreciate so very much spending these 40-some minutes with you. These are references, and we have others. We would advise you to study some of this history on your own so that you too can take pride in your own history. And I love this cartoon that was just sent to me about a month ago. So you're against immigration, splendid. When do you leave? We know that we'll never be able to take back the land that was taken from us. They're never going to leave. But we can take pride in the history, in the resistance that we have. And this resistance is going to continue, but it needs to continue through increased education and taking pride in our own history so that our young people will be able to accomplish everything and all the goals that are available here in America today. And that will only be accomplished if we'll allow them the opportunities that will be afforded to them. Thank you again, and I guess we'll take some questions now. If I'm sure Kate has some questions there.
Just thank you so much, Dr. McCoy. It's wonderful to hear your knowledge of American history and the culture that of the whether you are native or serving natives. It's a really important thing to be aware of when you're interacting with the culture. So if people have questions, please go ahead.
Apologize for having to speed through this, but I'm much more comfortable interacting personally with people, and but I appreciate the opportunity of presenting a little bit of this history anyway, and I look forward to meeting some of you in our travels.
Wonderful. So as Dr. McCoy said, we do have some time for questions. Please submit them in the Q&A chat box. If you've got your the slideshow in full screen, if you want to click that 4 arrow button, you'll be able to see the Q&A chat box, and we can take some time for questions now. We don't have any that have come in yet, so I'll just go ahead and remind everyone. Dr. McCoy referenced that you can access the slideshow. We have handouts which are available for download in the files pod in the lower left hand corner of the screen. And I'll also email those out to everyone who attended as well. And if you didn't know, we also record these webinars, and so the recordings are made available afterwards as well. So if you have friends, colleagues who you think might be interested in this, you can pass that on and they can view it at a later time. We also want to remind everyone that we will have our GIPRA evaluation. You should be redirected to it automatically when we close out today, but I will send the link in my email as well.
Kate, I would like to acknowledge the book by the title of our presentation, The Real All-Americans, and I highly recommend it to everyone. The first time I gave this presentation was at Harvard. I wanted them to hear how the Carlisle Indians had spanked them in football, and I had the book with me, but I couldn't get away from Harvard. Everybody wanted the book, and so it was passed around and read and read and read, so I had to reorder another book, and it's called The Real All-Americans by Sally Jenkins, and it was a national bestseller, and it's one of the richest descriptions of history that we have. And one of the things I didn't bring up in there is that two of the people that Jim Thorpe played against at Army were Dwight David Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. They were supposed to be the main defenseman to make sure that Jim Thorpe never got any yardage, and he decimated them, these two 5-star generals.
Great. I just actually I found the book on Amazon. I shared the link in the Q&A pod if you're interested in that book. So
terrific. Thank you.
It doesn't look like we have any questions. We'll just give a couple more minutes in case people have anything they want to ask. And yeah, we want to go again, remind everyone of our webinar coming up next month in this series, which is the overview of the Tribal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And we also have our Essential Substance Abuse Skills webinar on the 3rd Wednesday of each month. The next one is Basic Counseling Skills with Beth Boyd on August 20th. So it doesn't look like we have any questions, but feel free, if you have more questions on this topic, to email me, respond to I'll be sending out an email to everyone after the presentation, and if you have more questions about it, we can respond to those at that time too. We do have a comment from Lauren. Thank you for your knowledgeable presentation. I'm also very little bit I'm a very little bit Cherokee, so
All right.
so she didn't mind the focus on the Cherokee. So
Lauren, I mentioned to some national park rangers when I go back there, I don't know if you know, but Cherokee, North Carolina, uh, which is where our land trust is now, is the gateway to the most visited national park in America, the Great Smoky Mountains. And I happened to mention that we were going to reclaim that land. And I started furor at the national park there, and my wife had to pull me away. But just give us our national parks back, and that would be a good start, right? Because all those national parks were our lands at one time, and the Cherokee were throughout the whole Appalachian region. One more bit of history, maybe. In 1773, the Great Britain deeded all the land Appalachian west to the red man, and that's why many Indians fought with the British during the Revolution, because we had been given all of that land. And of course, that was like everything else. Everything that we were given was then taken back again when it was found useful for the white man. So any other Cherokee out there?
Yeah, or if you want to submit, if you are a member of another tribal nation,
Right.
yeah, we'd be interested to know if any others are represented. It doesn't look like anybody is responding to that at this point. So, Dr. McCoy, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to leave with us today before we close out?
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity. And, this is one of the sad histories, not only in America, just having come back from Australia and New Zealand, their governments have done much better at recognizing what has happened to the First Peoples, Aboriginal people. They've apologized. The Maori in New Zealand are treated very well. And our government just has not learned from other governments as to what is still owed based on what they took away from us. And so there's so much work that we need to do, and we will be doing it. And it starts at places like this, with the great center that you have there in Iowa and the training center that we have. And I just want to remind everyone, we're all First Peoples. We're all ancestors. It's not we versus them. It's not cowboys versus Indians. It's actually humankind. And we all need to be treated equally and as the human beings that we are. And that's the only message, is that it's not competition between the red man and the white man. It is competition to make us all equal, and that comes through our cultures and our societies.
Wonderful. Oh, thanks so much for those thoughts. And we did have one person write in to say that they are Lakota Sioux, so thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I just want to thank you again, Dr. McCoy. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us and to remind us of the history of the Native people all over the country, and just that the piece of that comes with everyone's story, as they might be people we interact with, whether they're clients or people we meet anywhere on the street. So yeah, I thank you again for just sharing that expertise and knowledge with us. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll hope to see you back here next time.
Kate, thank you. You've been marvelous, and I thank Alex again. Thank you.
Yes, thanks again to you as well, Alex. All
Thank
right,
you.
well, have a great day.
We have. Thank you.